People only respect money when they think it belongs to someone white. The words drifted across the polished marble lobby just as the elevator doors opened behind Elijah Brooks. Nobody knew who said it first. Maybe it was the young teller near the front desk. Maybe it was one of the businessmen waiting beside the velvet rope line. But the comment settled into the air like cigarette smoke, ugly and familiar, and nobody rushed to challenge it. Elijah heard every syllable while walking slowly toward the reception counter with a folded check inside his weathered brown envelope. Outside the enormous glass windows, freezing rain tapped against the streets of downtown Chicago, turning the morning traffic into blurred streaks of red and white light. Elijah removed his damp gloves carefully, exposing dark hands marked by old scars and years of labor, then placed the envelope on the counter with the same calm precision of a man setting down something valuable. The young receptionist glanced at the check, then at Elijah's worn coat, and her expression shifted immediately. She forced a polite smile that never reached her eyes before speaking into the office phone. "Mr. Whitmore," she whispered, "there's a situation at the front." Less than 30 seconds later, Daniel Whitmore emerged from the glass hallway leading toward the executive offices. His gray suit looked sharp enough to cut paper, and the silver cufflinks flashing beneath the lobby lights made him appear more like a politician than a bank manager. Employees straightened when he walked past them. Customers moved aside instinctively. Daniel enjoyed that effect. He approached Elijah without offering his hand, his cold blue eyes dropping directly toward the envelope. "Can I help you?" he asked. Elijah nodded once. "I'd like to cash the check." Daniel opened the envelope and unfolded the document slowly. The amount printed across the center was large enough to silence the nearest teller instantly. For a brief moment, Daniel's expression tightened with surprise, but it disappeared almost immediately beneath a thin smile filled with disbelief. "Where exactly did you get this?" he asked. Elijah answered calmly. "It belongs to me." A quiet laugh escaped Daniel's throat. Several people nearby turned to watch. The sound of computer keyboards faded. Even the security guard near the entrance leaned closer. Daniel held the check between two fingers as though touching something contaminated. "You expect me to believe this is yours?" he asked loudly. Elijah remained still. Rainwater continued dripping from the edge of his coat onto the polished marble floor. Daniel looked around the lobby, feeding on the attention gathering around him. "You know," he said with a grin, "most scammers at least try wearing a decent suit first." A few customers chuckled under their breath. Elijah said nothing. Daniel reached into his pocket, pulled out a silver lighter, and flicked it open with practiced ease. The tiny flame reflected across the glossy banking counters while the entire lobby watched him raise the corner of Elijah's check toward the fire. The tiny flame curled against the edge of the check, turning thick ivory paper dark brown before a thin line of smoke rose into the cold air of the lobby. Several customers stared openly now, their coffee cups frozen halfway to their mouths. Somebody near the teller stations quietly laughed. Elijah Brooks watched the fire without moving a single muscle in his face. The reflection of the flame danced across his dark eyes for a brief second before Daniel Whitmore finally shook the burning corner hard enough to kill it. Ash drifted downward onto the marble floor between them. Daniel smirked as if he had just won some private contest. "You should be grateful I stopped there," he said loudly. "Attempting fraud in a federal bank is not smart." Elijah slowly reached forward and took the damaged check back into his hands. His fingers brushed across the burned edge carefully, almost respectfully, as though touching something fragile from another lifetime. The lobby lights reflected softly against the old silver watch beneath his sleeve, but nobody noticed it except an elderly janitor polishing the glass doors nearby. The old man paused for half a second when he recognized the watch, then quickly lowered his eyes again. Elijah folded the check once more and slipped it back into the envelope without arguing. That silence irritated Daniel more than anger would have. Most people either begged or exploded when humiliated publicly. Elijah did neither. He simply stood there while rainwater dripped steadily from the hem of his coat. Daniel crossed his arms. Do you have another form of identification? Elijah nodded and calmly removed a leather wallet from his pocket. It looked worn enough to belong to a construction worker. Daniel glanced at the identification card inside and let out another short laugh. South Side Chicago, he muttered. That explains everything. A younger banker standing nearby smiled nervously, eager to stay on Daniel's good side. Elijah closed the wallet again. His hands were steady despite the dozens of eyes fixed on him. Years earlier, those same hands had carried lumber through freezing winters, repaired apartment roofs during summer heat waves, and held his mother's trembling fingers inside a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and faded hope. He remembered her voice clearly even now. She used to say banks only welcomed certain people through the front doors. Back then, Elijah promised himself he would become the kind of man nobody could dismiss again. Yet standing in that lobby, listening to strangers quietly judge him by the color of his skin and the age of his coat, he realized how little the world had actually changed. A woman wearing a camel-colored overcoat stepped closer to Daniel and whispered something while glancing toward Elijah. Daniel answered loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Ma'am, do not worry. We handle these situations all the time." The sentence spread humiliation through the lobby more effectively than shouting ever could. Elijah looked slowly around the massive room. The white marble columns. The polished brass railings. The giant chandelier hanging above the customer service desks. 23 years ago, his mother had stood inside this exact building holding rejection papers and shaking hands while employees avoided looking her in the eye. Elijah could still remember the rain from that day too. Chicago always seemed colder when dignity was taken from someone quietly. Daniel Whitmore hated silence because silence forced people to think, and thinking usually ruined the image he worked hard to build inside the bank. He preferred movement, pressure, and control. Every morning he entered the building exactly at 7:25, carrying the same black leather briefcase and stopping first at the espresso station beside the executive hallway. Employees memorized his routine the way factory workers memorized dangerous machinery. Nobody wanted to surprise him. Nobody wanted to disappoint him. The branch had become one of the most profitable in Illinois under his leadership, and Daniel reminded everyone of that fact constantly. Framed awards lined the walls behind his office door like military medals. Regional directors praised him during conferences. Wealthy clients requested him personally. But underneath the polished confidence lived something colder that most people noticed only after spending enough time around him. Daniel measured human value within seconds. Shoes. Watches. Skin color. Neighborhood. Accent. He absorbed details rapidly and transformed them into judgment before the other person finished speaking. Employees learned to follow his example if they wanted promotions. Loan officers denied applications more aggressively whenever certain last names appeared on paperwork. Security guards watched black customers more closely without being instructed directly. Nobody wrote those policies down. They simply understood what Daniel approved of. The culture spread quietly through the building like invisible smoke. Elijah Brooks could feel it immediately the moment he stepped inside that morning. Now he stood motionless while Daniel looked around the lobby with satisfaction, enjoying the audience gathered near the teller stations. The branch manager slowly slipped the silver lighter back into his pocket before speaking again. "You know what the problem is these days?" Daniel asked loudly enough for nearby customers to hear. "People think confidence can replace credibility." A middle-aged businessman waiting beside the investment desk chuckled softly. Elijah noticed several employees avoiding eye contact. Altogether. They were uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable enough to intervene. That was how systems survived. Not through loud cruelty alone, but through quiet cooperation from people who wanted to protect their paychecks. Daniel stepped closer to Elijah and lowered his voice slightly. "I could call federal investigators right now," he said. "But I am giving you a chance to walk away before this gets embarrassing." Elijah almost smiled at the irony of the sentence. Embarrassment had filled this building long before he arrived. It lingered in the marble floors, the polished counters, the cold stares from employees trained to associate whiteness with legitimacy and blackness with suspicion. 23 years earlier, his mother sat in these same offices wearing a church dress she ironed 3 times the night before because she believed appearance could buy dignity. She had requested a small business loan to expand her bakery on the south side. The loan officer denied her application within 12 minutes. 3 months later, another bakery opened only 6 blocks away under different ownership. Elijah never forgot the expression on his mother's face while leaving this bank in the rain with rejection papers pressed against her chest. Not anger. Not tears. Just humiliation carefully hidden behind exhausted pride. Daniel glanced at the damaged envelope again before shaking his head. "People like you always think rules do not apply," he muttered. Elijah finally spoke after nearly a full minute of silence. "Do you always destroy customer property in front of witnesses?" The calmness in his voice unsettled the room more than shouting would have. Daniel narrowed his eyes immediately. He was not accustomed to composure from people he believed were beneath him. He was especially not accustomed to being questioned inside his own kingdom. The temperature inside the lobby suddenly felt colder even though hundreds of recessed lights glowed against the marble ceiling above them. Daniel Whitmore stared at Elijah Brooks for several long seconds after hearing the question, his jaw tightening slightly as nearby customers pretended not to listen. The security guard near the entrance shifted his weight uneasily. A young teller stopped counting cash midway through a transaction. Silence spread across the room in slow waves. Daniel hated being challenged publicly because public authority was the foundation of his entire identity. The branch manager took one careful step closer until only the polished counter separated him from Elijah. "You are in no position to question me," he said quietly. Elijah did not lower his eyes. "I asked a simple question." Daniel forced a thin smile that looked more irritated than confident. "And I will give you a simple answer. This institution protects legitimate clients." He emphasized the word legitimate just enough for everyone nearby to understand what he truly meant. Elijah glanced briefly toward the giant bronze logo mounted behind the teller stations. The same logo had watched generations of people walk through those doors carrying hope, fear, debt, and desperation. Some left feeling respected. Others left feeling invisible. Rain continued sliding down the massive windows behind him, blurring the gray Chicago skyline into streaks of silver light. Daniel followed Elijah's gaze toward the logo and mistook the silence for defeat. That mistake made him bolder. "Now," he said loudly while straightening his expensive tie, "either you leave voluntarily, or security will escort you out." Several customers immediately looked toward the guard by the entrance. The man hesitated before slowly stepping forward. Elijah noticed the hesitation. The guard looked uncomfortable, almost embarrassed, but years of employment had trained him not to interfere with management decisions. Daniel turned toward the growing crowd with the confidence of a man certain nobody would oppose him. "Unfortunately," he announced, "we occasionally deal with fraudulent behavior." The sentence landed exactly the way he intended. Not direct enough to create legal trouble, but sharp enough to stain Elijah publicly. A woman near the investment office tightened her grip on her purse instinctively. Another customer pulled his teenage son slightly closer. Elijah absorbed every reaction without visible anger. That composure unsettled Daniel even more than before. Most people cracked under humiliation eventually. Their voices rose. Their hands shook. Their emotions gave Daniel an excuse to escalate. But Elijah remained calm, standing in his worn coat beneath the white lobby lights like a man carrying something far heavier than embarrassment. Daniel pointed toward the revolving doors. "Last warning." Elijah finally moved, but not toward the exit. Instead, he stepped slowly to the side and looked across the entire lobby as though studying details everyone else ignored. The old marble floor beneath the teller stations. The outdated security cameras mounted near the ceiling corners. The framed photographs of former executives lining the walls. Daniel frowned. "What exactly are you doing?" Elijah spoke softly. "Remembering." The answer confused the room. Daniel folded his arms impatiently. "You have 30 seconds before I call the police." Elijah nodded once, then carefully placed the damaged envelope flat against the polished counter. His fingertips rested on the burned edge for a brief moment before he looked directly at Daniel again. "Do you know what destroys a bank faster than bad investments?" he asked calmly. Daniel let out a short laugh. "I am not interested in philosophy lessons." Elijah's voice remained even. "Contempt." The single word seemed to echo strangely beneath the high ceiling. Outside, thunder rolled faintly across the city while rain hammered harder against the glass. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the receptionist's computer suddenly chimed with a sharp notification sound that caused her face to drain of color almost instantly. The sharp notification sound echoed through the silent lobby like a glass cracking somewhere deep inside the building. Every head turned toward the receptionist's desk immediately. The young woman stared at her computer monitor without blinking, her fingers frozen above the keyboard. Color drained slowly from her face while lines of text continued appearing across the screen. Daniel Whitmore noticed her expression and frowned impatiently. "What is it now?" he snapped. She swallowed hard before answering. "Sir, there is a priority. Authorization request entering the system." Daniel rolled his eyes. "Then process it." But the receptionist did not move. Her breathing had changed. The security guard near the entrance stopped walking toward Elijah and glanced uncertainly between them. Even the customers waiting beside the teller line sensed something shifting beneath the polished calm of the lobby. Daniel stepped toward the desk and lowered his voice. "Why are you standing there looking terrified?" The receptionist looked up slowly. "Because the authorization level is above regional clearance." The sentence caused several nearby employees to exchange nervous glances instantly. Daniel grabbed the keyboard himself and scanned the screen with visible irritation. At first his expression remained confident. Then confusion crept into his eyes. The authorization request carried executive-level encryption normally seen only during mergers, acquisitions, or board interventions. Daniel straightened immediately. "Who initiated this?" he demanded. The receptionist shook her head. "The system does not say." Behind him, Elijah Brooks remained completely still beside the marble counter, one hand resting lightly against the damaged envelope containing the burned check. Rain hammered harder against the giant windows now, washing gray shadows across the polished floor. Daniel forced himself to recover his composure quickly because too many people were watching. "It has nothing to do with this man," he said sharply. "Continue standard procedures." But the atmosphere inside the bank had already changed. Employees who had laughed minutes earlier suddenly avoided speaking altogether. One young teller quietly pulled up another monitor and began reading internal alerts with growing concern. Daniel noticed the movement immediately. "Do your jobs," he barked. His voice carried farther than before because nervousness had started slipping through the edges of his control. Elijah finally reached down and picked up the small burned fragment of ash resting near the counter. He studied it for a second before brushing it gently between his fingers. Daniel watched him with visible irritation. "You still have not left," he said. Elijah looked at him calmly. "Neither has the truth." The sentence landed heavily in the silence. A businessman near the investment office quietly stepped backward, suddenly less interested in being associated with the scene unfolding around him. The elderly janitor near the entrance continued polishing the glass doors slowly, but his eyes never left Elijah. Somewhere deeper inside the building, elevator doors opened with a soft metallic sound. Daniel ignored it. His focus remained fixed on maintaining authority in front of the crowd gathering around the lobby. "I am done entertaining this circus," he announced loudly. He pointed directly toward the revolving doors again. "Security, escort him outside immediately." The guard hesitated. For the first time since approaching, he looked directly at Elijah instead of Daniel. Something about Elijah's composure no longer matched the picture Daniel had painted. The old coat. The calm voice. The complete absence of fear. None of it fit together anymore. Daniel saw the hesitation and grew angrier. "That is an order." The guard took one uncertain step forward just as another notification chimed across every employee computer in the lobby simultaneously. Heads turned instantly toward the glowing monitors. This time the message appeared in bold red letters across the internal banking system. Executive Board arrival. Priority clearance required. Daniel's confidence flickered for the first time all morning. Then the private executive elevator at the far end of the lobby opened slowly, and 3 sharply dressed board members stepped into the silence while staring directly at Elijah Brooks. The sound of expensive dress shoes crossing marble floors echoed softly through the frozen lobby while rain continued beating against the towering glass walls outside. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The 3 board members walking out of the private executive elevator carried the quiet authority of people who never needed to raise their voices to control a room. Daniel Whitmore straightened immediately, forcing confidence back onto his face even though uncertainty had already begun creeping beneath it. He recognized all 3 executives. Instantly. Evelyn Carter from National Operations. Thomas Reed from Corporate Legal. And beside them walked Harold Bennett, one of the oldest board members in the company's history, a man who almost never visited regional branches personally. Daniel quickly adjusted his tie and stepped forward with a polished smile. "Mr. Bennett," he said carefully, "we were not informed about an inspection today." But Harold Bennett barely acknowledged him. His attention remained fixed entirely on Elijah Brooks standing quietly beside the counter with rainwater still darkening the shoulders of his old coat. For one long second, the entire bank seemed to stop breathing. Then Harold spoke words nobody inside the lobby expected to hear. "Mr. Brooks," he said respectfully, "we have been trying to reach you upstairs." A wave of confusion spread instantly across the room. Daniel blinked hard, convinced he misunderstood what he had just heard. The receptionist looked like she had forgotten how to breathe. Even the security guard slowly lowered his hand from the radio attached to his belt. Elijah turned calmly toward the executives, his expression unchanged. "I was delayed," he answered softly. Harold's eyes drifted toward the burned edge of the envelope resting against the marble counter. The older man's face tightened almost invisibly. Evelyn Carter noticed it too. Her gaze moved slowly across the lobby, taking in the uncomfortable silence, the staring customers, and finally Daniel Whitmore standing rigid beside the teller station. Nobody needed to explain what had happened. The atmosphere explained everything already. Daniel forced out a nervous laugh. "I apologize," he said quickly, "there seems to have been some confusion regarding identification procedures." Elijah looked at him without anger. Without satisfaction either. That calmness became more frightening than outrage. Daniel suddenly realized he knew absolutely nothing about the man standing in front of him. The old coat. The worn gloves. The quiet voice. He had mistaken simplicity for weakness, and now the mistake stood exposed beneath the bright white lobby lights for everyone to witness. Rain rolled down the windows in heavy streams, distorting the city skyline behind Elijah into soft gray shadows. Harold Bennett stepped closer and lowered his voice respectfully. "The transfer documents are prepared whenever you are ready." Several employees nearby exchanged stunned glances immediately. Transfer documents. The words landed heavily inside Daniel's chest. His mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Acquisition. Ownership restructuring. Executive authority. The realization began forming slowly like ice spreading across glass. Elijah picked up the damaged envelope again and brushed a thumb lightly across the blackened edge of the check. Tiny flakes of ash drifted onto the polished marble floor below. Nobody laughed anymore. The same customers who had watched him with suspicion minutes earlier now avoided meeting his eyes entirely. Shame had settled over the lobby like another layer of winter cold. Elijah finally looked toward Daniel again. "You asked earlier where I got this check," he said quietly. Daniel swallowed hard but said nothing. Elijah's voice remained calm, almost gentle. "I authorized it myself." Thunder rolled somewhere far above the city while silence crushed the room from every direction. Daniel felt the blood drain from his face as the truth finally reached him completely. The man he humiliated, insulted, and publicly accused inside his own branch was not a criminal, not a scammer, and not a desperate customer trying to survive. Elijah Brooks was the new majority owner of the bank. Daniel Whitmore felt the entire lobby changing around him in ways he could not control anymore. Just minutes earlier, every conversation, every stare, and every movement inside the branch had followed his direction like actors obeying a script he wrote himself. Now the same employees who once rushed to impress him stood frozen behind their desks, carefully avoiding his eyes. The customers who laughed at Elijah Brooks moments ago suddenly stared at the marble floor or pretended to check their phones. Shame moved through the room quietly, but Daniel could feel it pressing against his chest harder with every passing second. Harold Bennett stepped beside Elijah with visible respect while Evelyn Carter opened a black leather portfolio containing several official documents. Thomas Reed from corporate legal removed his glasses slowly and glanced toward the damaged check still resting inside Elijah's envelope. "We were informed there was an incident involving financial documents," he said calmly. Nobody answered him immediately. The silence itself became the answer. Daniel forced himself to speak before the situation slipped further beyond his control. "This entire misunderstanding was based on incomplete information," he said quickly. "Had I known Mr. Brooks was connected to the acquisition," Elijah interrupted him softly. "Connected?" The single word cut deeper than anger could have. Daniel stopped speaking immediately. Rain rolled down the giant windows behind them in long silver streams while thunder rumbled somewhere far above downtown Chicago. Elijah looked around the lobby slowly, taking in the frightened faces of employees, the nervous customers, and finally the security guard who now stood motionless near the entrance with embarrassment written clearly across his face. Elijah did not look triumphant. That unsettled Daniel even more. Most powerful men enjoyed moments like this. They raised their voices. They humiliated people publicly. They reminded everyone who held authority. But Elijah carried himself with a strange calmness that transformed the entire room into a mirror reflecting everyone's behavior back at them. Evelyn Carter carefully handed Elijah a tablet containing final authorization documents. "The transfer became official 37 minutes ago," she said respectfully. "You are now the majority controlling owner of First Northern Financial." Several employees gasped quietly under their breath. One teller nearly dropped a stack of deposit slips onto the counter. Daniel's face lost what little color remained. The realization hit him fully now. The man he accused of fraud. The man he threatened with police. The man whose check he burned in front of customers and staff. That man owned the bank. Daniel glanced toward the blackened edge of the envelope again and suddenly saw the scene from outside himself for the very first time. The laughter. The suspicion. The public humiliation. He heard his own voice repeating phrases that now sounded smaller and uglier than before. "People like you. Legitimate clients. Fraudulent behavior." Each sentence now hung over the lobby like smoke that refused to disappear. Elijah finally signed the digital authorization form with calm steady movements. The silver watch beneath his sleeve caught the light briefly while employees watched in complete silence. Harold Bennett nodded respectfully afterward. "Congratulations, Mr. Brooks." Elijah handed the tablet back and looked once more toward Daniel. Their eyes met for several long seconds. Daniel expected rage. Instead, he found disappointment. Somehow that felt worse. Elijah spoke quietly enough that only the nearest employees could hear clearly. My mother walked into this building 23 years ago asking for help to expand her bakery. Daniel lowered his eyes slightly. Elijah continued. She left believing she was invisible. Nobody moved. Nobody even touched their keyboards anymore. The only sound inside the lobby came from rain striking the glass and the low hum of the heating system above them. Elijah looked toward the giant bronze logo mounted on the wall behind the teller stations. Institutions do not collapse because of money first, he said calmly. They collapse when people stop feeling human inside them. Daniel swallowed hard, unable to answer because deep down he understood every word was true. No one inside the lobby moved after Elijah Brooks finished speaking. The words lingered beneath the marble ceiling long after his voice faded, settling into the silence like dust that could no longer be ignored. Rain continued sliding down the giant windows overlooking downtown Chicago while the white lobby lights reflected against the wet floor near the entrance. Daniel Whitmore stood motionless beside the teller counter with his shoulders tense and his hands hanging stiffly at his sides. For the first time in years, he looked like a man who no longer recognized the room around him. Employees avoided eye contact with him now. Customers who had laughed earlier quietly stepped farther away, embarrassed by their own behavior. The entire atmosphere of the bank had shifted beneath him in less than 10 minutes. Harold Bennett slowly closed the leather portfolio containing the finalized transfer documents while Evelyn Carter spoke softly with regional executives over her phone near the elevator. Yet even with all the movement happening around him, Elijah remained calm and still, his attention resting on the burned edge of the check inside his hands. Daniel finally cleared his throat, but his voice sounded smaller than before. "Mr. Brooks," he said carefully, "I would like to apologize for the misunderstanding." The sentence felt rehearsed the moment it left his mouth. Elijah looked at him quietly without answering immediately. Daniel forced himself to continue. "Had I known who you were," Elijah interrupted gently. "That is the problem." Daniel stopped speaking. Elijah folded the damaged check slowly before slipping it back into the envelope. "You should not need to know who someone is before treating them with dignity." The words landed softly, but every employee near the teller stations heard them clearly. Daniel lowered his eyes for a brief moment. His polished confidence had disappeared completely now, replaced by something far more uncomfortable. Recognition. He began replaying the morning inside his own mind from the beginning. The laughter. The assumptions. The public humiliation. The way customers followed his lead without questioning him. He realized none of it had started because of a check. It had started the moment Elijah walked through the doors wearing old clothes and dark skin inside a building trained to associate wealth with whiteness. Daniel glanced toward the security guard near the entrance and saw the same realization spreading across the man's face too. Elijah looked around the lobby slowly before speaking again. "My mother worked 16-hour days in a bakery she loved," he said quietly. "When she came here asking for a loan, nobody saw her ideas. Nobody saw her work ethic. They only saw a black woman they assumed would fail." Rain hammered harder against the windows as the city darkened beneath thick winter clouds. Several employees lowered their heads. An older teller near the back wiped tears from her eyes discreetly. Elijah continued calmly. "She stopped trusting banks after that day. Not because she lost money. Because she lost dignity." Daniel swallowed hard. "I was wrong," he admitted quietly. The sentence barely rose above the hum of the heating system overhead, but the sincerity inside it changed the room more than shouting ever could. Elijah studied him silently for several seconds. Then, to everyone's surprise, he nodded once. Not with triumph. Not with cruelty. Just acknowledgement. "Then learn from it," Elijah said softly. Harold Bennett glanced toward Daniel carefully, expecting Elijah to order immediate termination or public discipline. Instead, Elijah looked toward the executive team and spoke in the same calm voice he had carried all morning. "No one is losing their job today. Several employees looked up in disbelief. Daniel stared at him, stunned. Elijah continued. But this branch will change. He looked toward the giant bronze logo mounted behind the counters one more time while rainwater streaked across the glass walls like fading shadows. Because no customer should ever walk into a bank and feel invisible again. By the time evening settled over downtown Chicago, most employees had already gone home. The massive lobby that once echoed with nervous whispers and embarrassed silence now rested beneath a softer kind of quiet. Outside the towering glass walls, rain still drifted through the city in thin silver lines, reflecting against traffic lights and wet pavement 30 stories below the clouds. The marble floors glowed faintly beneath dimmed overhead lighting while distant thunder faded somewhere beyond the skyline. Elijah Brooks stood alone near the teller counter where everything had begun earlier that morning. His old brown coat rested neatly over one arm now, revealing a simple dark sweater beneath it. Nothing about his appearance had changed, yet the entire building treated him differently. That reality stayed with him more heavily than ownership papers or executive authority ever could. Near the center of the polished floor, a faint gray stain from the burned check still remained visible beneath the lights. Elijah looked down at it quietly. Such a small mark. Such a small moment. Yet it carried decades of memory inside it. He could still picture his mother standing inside this same bank years ago with tired eyes and flour dust still clinging to her coat sleeves after leaving her bakery early for the appointment. She believed hard work could earn respect anywhere. Life eventually taught her otherwise. Elijah slowly walked toward the giant windows overlooking the city. His reflection moved across the glass beside the blurred lights of Chicago at night. Behind him, the bronze bank logo remained mounted high above the lobby, polished and permanent, like institutions always tried to appear. But Elijah understood something most powerful men never learned. Buildings did not create trust. People did. And trust disappeared quietly every time dignity was denied to someone who walked through those doors searching for help instead of judgment. Soft footsteps echoed behind him. Daniel Whitmore approached carefully from the far side of the lobby, no longer carrying the sharp confidence that once controlled every room he entered. His tie was loosened now. His shoulders looked heavier somehow. He stopped several feet away from Elijah and stared briefly at the rain sliding down the glass. "I kept thinking about what you said," Daniel admitted quietly. Elijah remained silent. Daniel swallowed once before continuing. "About people feeling invisible." The branch manager looked back toward the teller stations where employees had spent years following his example without questioning it. "I convinced myself professionalism meant treating everyone the same," he said softly. "But the truth is, I never did." Elijah finally turned toward him. There was no hatred in his eyes. Only exhaustion. Daniel glanced downward again. "I do not expect forgiveness." Elijah looked toward the dark city outside before answering. "Good," he said calmly. "Because this is not about forgiveness." Daniel nodded slowly. The honesty of the response seemed to affect him more than anger would have. For several long seconds, neither man spoke. The lobby hummed quietly around them while rain tapped gently against the glass walls. Finally Elijah stepped back toward the marble counter and rested his fingertips against its cold surface. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "this bank starts over." Daniel looked at him carefully. Elijah continued staring at the city lights reflecting across the wet streets below. "Not because I own it," he said. "Because people deserve better from places that hold their futures." Somewhere behind them, the cleaning crew entered through the side doors carrying mops and buckets, their voices low and tired after a long day. Elijah noticed them immediately and nodded politely as they passed. The workers smiled back in surprise. Then the lobby grew quiet once more while the rain continued falling across Chicago, washing the city slowly beneath the night.